It's good to be with everyone at the Shelley Preparedness Fair. I have fond memories of the past 2 years being with you in person, and only sorry that weather did not permit me and my son to be able to fly in, but it's good to be with you by video recording. I want to start with as I usually do in these addresses, a world affairs briefing to bring you up to date on what's going on in the world relative to your preparedness and what you have to prepare for. I'll talk somewhat about President Trump and his latest efforts or failures, I might say, to get what he needs to secure the country. I want to talk about a little bit about the economy, a little bit about then the military threats that are facing, and then we'll talk about some preparedness issues. The big story, as everyone knows, is that Trump has agreed, or at least it's the word on the street is that he's going to be signing the government omnibus bill, which funds the bill through September. It's going to be the lead story in tomorrow's World Affairs Brief called Trump's Bad Border Deal. You know, last week, President Trump agreed to a temporary end to the government shutdown, and he vowed to declare an emergency if Congress did not finally agree to fund his partial wall. And I made a fairly strong issue in the World Affairs Brief that this is only a partial wall. It's only going to fund, at best, his $5.7 billion, some 100 miles of wall. Well, in the current deal presented to the president, which he's expected to sign, he's going to get only a token $1.37 billion for some moderate-sized steel barriers, but at the expense of a lot of other bad compromises hidden in the bill, which few have been able to read. Now, this is a very bad deal, getting essentially nothing in exchange for all the bad press he got during the long government shutdown. I'm going to analyze with you why his attempts to declare an emergency have not gone through. And I'm afraid the overall picture is it shows that Trump really, despite his book, The Art of the Deal, doesn't know how to play hardball with the deep state, the Democrats, and their allies in the courts. More and more it's becoming obvious that to Trump's supporters that Trump is the master of the verbal deal or the verbal promise, but regularly fails to follow through. You know, talk is easy and talk is cheap, but effective action against the deep state, a controlled and hostile media, a left liberal controlled Congress and the courts is extremely difficult and cannot be done by listening to advisors who will only tell you or tell Trump that he is limited to existing executive precedent and legal interpretations of the law. I'm not putting all of my blame on Trump for failure to follow through. It would be tough for any experienced conservative lawyer who knows what he's doing, which Trump isn't and doesn't have the experience. But it's time for dramatic action that breaks all existing precedents, as I'll explain shortly. Sadly, I don't think Trump is ever going to figure it out on his own. So as we talk about the deal that has gone or is going through, it's important that it even contains money, $527 million, to the countries allowing caravans to come to the U.S. as humanitarian assistance to those countries. And that assistance, consistently going to Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala, has never helped stop the flow. These three countries are in extreme turmoil. The crime rate is high. Gang members are at an all-time high, and these people are coming to the United States, and they have been powerless to stop it. I'm afraid more money isn't going to help that. Now, Trump says that he's not waiting for Congress to move forward with building his long-promised wall. He's pointed out that work is already underway on the U.S.-Mexico border with funding previously appropriated. Now, this is true. There is some repair and restoration of the fencing going on, but it's not having much effect in stopping some estimated 10,000 illegal aliens that cross the border every week, almost all the places, you know, where there is no fencing. One of the things that, you know, Senator Richard Durbin of Illinois, the second-ranking Democrat in the upper chamber and a member of the House Senate committee that negotiated this week's spending deal, said, we shut down the government for 35 days. We put Americans through this crisis. We jeopardized our economy. And for what, he says? It was totally unnecessary. Well, That should actually be a conservative complaint. No, it wasn't unnecessary, but Trump just wasted all that pain and effort by failing to bring it to any level of fruition. Trump's problem is that he can't take the heat anymore for any more government shutdown. He said, I don't want to see a shutdown. He told reporters on Tuesday, I don't think you're going to see a shutdown. A shutdown would be a terrible thing, later adding that there's no reason for a second shutdown. Well, that isn't true. As I pointed out in the World Affairs Brief on many issues, Trump needs to learn how to use the shutdown more selectively, to use incoming. There's a constant flow of funds. The government isn't out of money just because it, quote, shuts down. Use incoming funds to fund or keep essentials funded, but using the lack of money not to pay for any more unconstitutional spending like foreign aid, UN funding, Planned Parenthood support, education grants, support for public television. He could also unilaterally stop all military intervention around the world and save billions this year alone. So instead of having a shortfall in funds to cut foreign aid, he has authorized, or he's going to sign, if he signs this bill, it contains more foreign aid for Israel, Jordan, and Ukraine, and totaling about $5.2 billion. And that's enough to get what he was asking for the wall. Even worse, there's nearly twice as much funding for refugee assistance in this bill as it does for funding of the wall, $3.4 billion to be exact. I mean, here we are trying to build a wall to stop illegals from coming in, and we've got $3.4 billion to bring in more refugees from Africa and the Middle East in the country, and put them up and give them green cards and offer them citizenship. Now, it doesn't help that rhino Republicans like Senator Lindsey Graham is urging Trump to move on. Lindsey Graham, who's a regular contact or in regular contact with Trump at the White House, said Trump was inclined to take the deal and move on, and I think he's right. The important point is that, which David Horowitz pointed out, is that the bad thing about this bill going before Trump is that it's an omnibus spending bill. It isn't just a continuing resolution as he signed 2 weeks ago. This will take the government and fund it completely through next September. So it's actually better to pass a short-term one if you want to keep the issue alive. Furthermore, this deal, and being a long-term funding solution, once the deadline is punted for the remainder of the fiscal year up to September, there is no hope left. The issue is dead. This is in stark contrast to what Trump claimed at the rally in El Paso as Trump defended his 5-week shutdown. He said it was very important that we did it. If we didn't do that shutdown, we would not have been able to show this country, these politicians in the world, what the hell is happening at the border. Well, what he says is true, but if Trump signs this, he destroys all those same beneficial effects. People will forget until next December and move on to other issues. Some conservatives, quite a few, are not assuaged by what's happening here, especially Mark Meadows of the Freedom Caucus in the House contradicted the White House line and declared that the agreement was a bad deal for the president. Only in Washington, D.C., he said, can we start out with needing $25 billion for border security measures and expect applause at $1.37 billion. I mean, only in D.C. is this a winning deal. Meadows and his allies were among those targeted by the White House in hopes of avoiding a more threatening conservative revolt. In a meeting with the Freedom Caucus in the Oval Office that happened this week, it was partly aimed at urging them to hold their fire in television interviews when talking about this bill. That last paragraph from the New York Times is making a lot of Trump supporters angry. The White House pressuring conservatives to keep quiet while the president goes down the road of bad compromise. It's going to be worse in the end, as there's no bounds to the bad additions to the bill that almost no one has fully read yet. That's a good reason for only doing a continuing resolution, if nothing else, to give people a chance to read what's in the bill. Well, the bill has come out, and some people are pouring through it as I'm recording this on Thursday, so by Saturday we'll know some more information about it. But one of the problems with this bill is that ICE, of course, the Democrats are negotiating to reduce the number of beds that ICE has in detention. And the White House is bragging that they got the House to agree, the House to agree to almost to increasing the number of beds. But this really only increases the ability of ICE to catch and release. What happened to the vow that illegal aliens would be forced to wait in Mexico while their asylum claims were processed? Well, apparently that only applies to those who make application at a border crossing. They have to go wait in Mexico. The fact that ICE in the judicial system allows for those who are caught entering illegally to claim asylum and stay in the U.S. at these detention centers, and then when they're full, they get released. This only gives further incentives to come in illegally rather than apply at the border stations. Trump claims that he's going to be looking for any, quote, landmines inserted into the bill. But I can guarantee you he's not going to read the bill. He's going to depend on someone else to point things out to them, and his advisors may not do that. As Mickey Krause noted, here's a landmine. In this bill, you can't remove any, quote, potential sponsor or any member of a household of a potential sponsor. This is explicit amnesty for anyone who's in the family of someone who's near and or related to an unaccompanied minor that unlawfully crossed the border and is sitting in these detention centers. In other words, this allows anyone related to that minor who could be a potential sponsor to have automatic ability to stay in the country. Is Trump going to sign this? Yeah, probably. But Trump's answer to his failures to hold the line is to claim, as he did in El Paso, just so you know, we're building the wall anyway, Trump said to Cheers. Now, this is a kind of interesting claim because it really does assuage people when Trump said, well, I've got ways to build the wall. So far, the White House has refused to reveal any of these so-called other options that the president claims to have. The Times says of this, it says, those options involve diverting money from other programs that potentially declaring a national emergency to access further funds. In the end, aides said Trump may even secure more money than Congress denied him, but those options were just as available to Trump in December before the shutdown that closed federal agencies. That's a good point. Why, if Trump has all these other options, hasn't Trump used those executive options before and avoided this fruitless confrontation? And it's only fruitless because he didn't get anything from shutting down the government. It's probably because the Democrats in the court stand ready to block him at every turn, even if he declares an emergency. Either way, says the Times, Trump's aides are now focused on finding pots of money that with the president's traditional discretion can be reprogrammed toward the wall. If that's not enough, he can still declare an emergency, although there are many Republicans that oppose this and would invariably draw a court challenge. So here's the real question. If Trump, through executive shifting of funds, can find another $23 billion, as he claims he can, to fund the wall, why sign this omnibus bill at all? If you don't need the paltry $1.3 billion and you find it a pittance as it is, why not do the same thing to fund the TSA and the air traffic controllers during a continued shutdown, where you can hold the Democrats hostage to the fact that their programs won't be funded unless they give them a wall? Frankly, I think everything Trump tries to do is that is right is going to draw a court challenge. At some point, Trump has to say, the court's entitled to its opinion, but in this case, the court is clearly outside its jurisdiction or outside the law, and I'm going to disregard it and proceed under emergency powers granted to me by Congress. Yes, then the courts would conjure up some excuse to rule that Trump's use of emergency powers to shift funding is not allowed, even though it's been allowed for many decades. But presidents have done it before. And ultimately, Trump would have to say the courts are incorrect and face the impeachment proceedings would inevitably follow because they would claim that he was violating the rule of law and defying the supremacy of the courts. Well, the supremacy of the courts is really not constitutional. It's a co-equal branch of government. And, you know, the Democrats loved it when FDR said, told the Supreme Court to take a hike. I'm not going to follow. You enforce it. But they certainly wouldn't do it then. And I'm convinced that there's rhino Republicans like Senator Mitt Romney and Mitt Romney and Mitch McConnell, who would join with the Democrats to decry this defiance of the courts and support, quote, the rule of law and vote to impeach the president. Still, I think it's better for a president to go out fighting the deep state and improper dominance of an activist court than to compromise and call it a victory. Because at least you encourage your people to stand and fight with the former. And if you take the latter role of giving in and compromising and calling it a victory, you compromise your own conservative constituents and talk them into believing that partial socialist solutions, partial pro-government, and deep state solutions are okay. Make no mistake, the border crisis is growing, not diminishing. It is estimated at current rates of people rushing to get in through any border that isn't covered by a wall, that over 5 million illegals will enter the U.S. in the next year, adding to the 20 to 30 million illegal entries already, illegal aliens already in the country. 42 million seekers of citizenship or asylum are watching from outside the borders to determine exactly when and how's the best time to make their move. This suggests that open borders could potentially attract many, many more millions after the 5 millions. So as I've said before, Trump either solves this now, or the Democratic left, independent, and rhino Republican majorities, let me repeat that, the majority of voters in this country really are Democrats, leftists, independents, and rhino Republicans. And their majorities will now become so big with increased amnesty to illegal aliens that by or after the 2020 election, conservatives may never win another election in this country. So that's a serious situation. And as I say, Trump has done some good things in his administration, but he fails to follow through. For example, he championed the cause, the only president to do so, of condemning birthright citizenship, and initially saying that he was going to use executive power to stop it. He could have done that because it was only a non-binding court interpretation that has been voluntarily implemented through bureaucratic rulings within all the subsequent administrations. He doesn't have to do that. He can change that bureaucratic establishment and say, we no longer recognize anyone born in the country as a citizen unless they're born to citizens. But he failed to follow through, said, we'll let Mr. Ryan, the Speaker of the House, take it up in Congress. And of course, Rat Ryan, as Jeff Renz calls him, failed to do that. Trump also, in his State of the Union message, condemned late-term abortion. But on the other hand, he's never done anything to really stop abortion. Now, I have to say that no one that Trump would, in fact, nominate for the Supreme Court that really vowed that he was going to stop abortion could get confirmed. Everyone has had to pay homage to the abortion lobby by saying Roe v. Wade is settled law. And that's a problem. In fact, the two Trump appointees have not voted in any pro-abortion way since they've been on the bench. In Trump's State of the Union address, he also got a lot of applause from people by saying, in response to Venezuela and its problems as a socialist country, said, America will never be a socialist country. Well, this indicates a certain amount of ignorance on the part of Trump, because we already are a halfway socialist country, especially if you understand the difference between Fabian socialism and full socialism. Full socialism is like in communism, where you have full state control of all of the industries, the businesses, and private property. But Fabian socialism is where you continue to own the business, the property, but the government controls it with increasing regulations. And that's the kind of socialism which the globalists practice, because then they can fool people into thinking you own it, you're still free, even though our freedoms get less and less each year. Let's talk a little bit about foreign policy now. Trump continues, even though he's done the right thing in saying we need to pull out of Syria and pull out half of the troops in Afghanistan. We have to look at the context of this, that Trump is running on his gut feelings here, which are correct. Nevertheless, he does not have the sophisticated arguments necessary to counter what military briefers and intelligence briefers tell him about the so-called threats. For example, he was going to pull out all the troops of Afghanistan, as he said during his campaign promise. Then they called him into a meeting in the tank in the Pentagon, which is a soundproof special auditorium there, where they gave him 2 hours of briefings from military specialists on why the war on terrorism required that we still be in 150 countries and how we're fighting terrorism among all these countries. And they convinced him. Until about 3 weeks ago, when he said, no, I've decided I'm going to pull out anyway. In other words, after 9 months of being back in or allowing you to put more troops in Afghanistan, what's the result? There's no result. And so he basically is turned against them. They don't mind so much in Afghanistan as they mind pulling out of Syria, because that's where the major globalist agenda is taking place right now, in Syria. As many of my subscribers to the World Affairs Brief know, the reason that the U.S. went into Syria, or decided to attack Syria, was because Israel was initially assigned by the globalists clear back in 2004 to initiate a war with Iran by attacking her nuclear program. Israel told the globalists a couple of years later, after they were continuing to stall about attacking Iran, that we want you to take care of Syria. It has all these Scud missiles armed with chemical weapons that could really damage Israel as retaliation if Israel attacked Iran. And that's why in 2013, the U.S. started to declare a no-fly zone, which is really an excuse to take control over the sky so that they can send in special operations and attack a country. And that attack on Syria, in fact, was, how should I say, there was an excuse given by Barack Obama to justify the attack, and saying that if Syria uses chemical weapons anyway, we will attack and we will destroy Syria. So they were setting up the criteria that they could use a false flag then to take away or take out Syria. Well, that false flag never had to be used at that time, because John Kerry got before a London press conference in 2013, and a reporter asked him, well, it's obvious you're going to attack Syria. Is there any way Syria can avoid this attack? The Secretary of State Kerry said, well, yes, they could give up their chemical weapons and we wouldn't attack. He was just talking off the top of his head. But Syria immediately said, we accept. And you could bet that John Kerry got a real tongue lashing as he got off that stage, because he had just given them an excuse to escape from the globalist agenda, which was to take down Syria so that Israel could go forward with the attack on Iran. Well, that changed the whole complexity of everything in the Middle East, because the U.S. had no choice but to comply and hold off while Syria, they saw whether Syria would comply, and they did remove all their chemical weapons. It was certified by the international community and by the United States itself. That's when the U.S. used the invasion of Libya to create so many terrorists that they were shipping into Syria to fund a rebel force, the Syrian rebels, to take down Syria by deceit, claiming that it was an internal civil war, when it wasn't. It was an external invasion by mostly other Islamic radicals and jihadists from Libya, from Egypt, from a lot of them from Tunisia. But, and they used the chemical attack, false flag attack, when the Syrian rebels used it in a suburb of Damascus and blamed it on the government of Syria. And I asked at the time in the World Affairs Brief, why would Bashar al-Assad, a medical trained doctor in the West, very rational civil person, why would he use chemical weapons in an urban area where you cannot control who the victims are going to be? No one with any military experience, no civilian who's president would know that you don't use, all of them would know that you don't use chemical weapons in an urban environment. It's only to be used for troops out in the open. And of course, he didn't use it. Syrian rebels later admitted that they got the older sarin and other gases from Saudi Arabia or from Turkey. In fact, there have been 3 chemical weapons attacks that the U.S. has blamed on Syria that were done by U.S.-backed Syrian rebels. But it did justify increasing intrusion in Syria by the deep state. And Trump, of course, didn't know anything about this. The deep state was actually creating al-Qaeda. They created the Syrian rebels. And eventually they created ISIS as well. When the Syrian rebels were not able to defeat them, they took about half of the Syrian rebels and they rebranded them as ISIS and gave them priority on funding and sent them into Iraq to cause this horror of invasion of Iraq, and so that they could eventually turn them around, pretend to drive them out, and get them back into Syria. And the U.S. would, proclaim that they were fighting ISIS. They would bomb targets, but they would always alert ISIS before those bombings so that those were empty buildings being bombed. When ISIS took over Mosul, for example, they had a victory parade going out of the city on a major highway with all their armored equipment that they had captured in Iraq. And the U.S. fighters were loitering above and didn't attack that convoy. when they were in plain sight, when there would have been no civilian casualties? Why not? Because they had orders not to attack. When they eventually liberated Mosul, they left a portion of the city undefended, and when they had surrounded Mosul so that the Iraq or ISIS fighters could escape. In the final battle of Raqqa, where ISIS was supposedly defeated, the U.S. paid for 50 semi-trucks driven by Arab drivers to come in and bring out ISIS, their families, and their heavy weapons. This was said in the press as a peace deal that ISIS would give up if they got to leave, without their weapons. But the U.S. allowed them to take their heavy weapons with them. I believe that ISIS was reintegrated into the Syrian rebels, so that when Donald Trump said, I'm going to pull the troops out of Syria, it was very easy for the deep state to come and tell him, no, ISIS is not defeated, because they can bring ISIS out of their reintegration with Syrian rebels at any time, as they did. And in fact, all of the neocon Republicans, even in the Senate, passed a resolution demanding that President Trump not pull out of ISIS. Once again, the main focus is on Iran. Assad in Syria was only to be overthrown and taken under control by Islamic radicals so that the U.S. could give Israel the green light to attack Iran. And now Israel has been attacking Iran incessantly in Syria, almost 100 or 200 missile and aerial attacks each month, trying to provoke Iran into retaliating against Israel so they can start this full-blown war. Trump mentioned Iran, following the basic propaganda line he's been given that Iran is the biggest sponsor of the terrorism in the world. I have challenged administration officials to tell me one terrorist group that is, in fact, funded by Iran. Is ISIS funded by Iran? Not at all. I can't admit. Is Al-Qaeda funded by Iran? Not at all. The only ones they can name are fighting or funded by Iran are those that are fighting the U.S.-backed terrorists in Yemen, the U.S.-backed terrorists in Syria, and around the world. So Iran is, in fact, trying to fight the U.S.-backed terrorists, but their fighting organizations and militias are not considered terrorists. But in any case, Iran is being put up as the boogeyman of the world. John Bolton recently, on the 40th anniversary of the Ayatollah Khomeini taking power over the CIA-backed Shah of Iran, basically lashed out at Iran and saying, you're not going to be around long to celebrate another anniversary, threatening them basically with war. In fact, there's a conference in Poland taking place, I think it's next week, where Israel and about 50 other nations are going to be meeting on how to combat Iran. And Netanyahu just gave an interview, which I'm quoting in tomorrow's World Affairs Brief, which he said specifically that these are nations that are binding together to essentially start a war with Iran. So that war is going to come. I thought it was going to start next year. The situation wasn't ripe enough because of Russian interference in Syria, stopping the agenda of taking down Syria. But, and I'm not sure how they're going to start the war unless Iran does retaliate against Israel and give Israel an excuse to do a launch directly on Iranian territory. So far, Israel has only been attacking Iranian advisors in Syria itself. Also in the State of the Union, going back to domestic policy, I note that Trump put into the State of the Union one of Ivanka's favorite pet causes, which is aid to women around the developing world. Once again, what business do we have as the United States without sufficient money to pay our own debts with a public debt of $22 trillion, and that doesn't cover the unfunded liabilities and pensions and Social Security. What business do we have giving any foreign aid to anyone, let alone aid to children or women in other developing countries? Trump also in the State of the Union mentioned trade with China, bragging that we're about to have a marvelous deal with China. But in fact, one of the greatest mistakes he ever made was talking about how wonderful Xi Jinping was of China. Now, what business does the person have who's a president of the free nation lauding and saying that a dictator holding many millions of people in prison in China and cutting off all liberties is a wonderful person. It just shows that Trump is really subject to flattery and is capable of giving it out, but it clouds his judgment. The worst thing also happened this time about North Korea. North Korea, Kim Jong-un in his State of the Union speech and even talking about North Korea recently offers economic incentives to North Korea in his new meeting with Kim Jong-un that's going to take place in Hanoi. He predicted that the authoritarian country would someday become, quote, a great economic powerhouse under Kim's leadership. I believe that's more evidence that Trump is heading to Vietnam with incentives in hand in exchange for more indefinite promises of future denuclearization. And that's a problem because, when he talks about the wonderful things that is going to happen, you've got to remember, if I can review, months after the Singapore summit, Trump said that Kim had written him beautiful letters and that the two fell in love. He also waxed eloquent about North Korea with his help becoming an economic powerhouse. He said, North Korea under the leadership of Kim Jong-un will become a great economic powerhouse. He may surprise some, but he won't surprise me because I have gotten to know him and fully understand how capable he is. North Korea will become a different kind of rocket, an economic one, Trump tweeted last Friday. The two leaders in Vietnam will need to work, of course, on the meaning of North Korea's promise of denuclearization. Indeed, something as simple as denuclearization shouldn't be that ambiguous. It wasn't at first, but as Kim continues to stall and redefine what it means, Trump has set himself up to accept it and to wait for action if it ever comes at all. The U.S. Special Envoy to North Korea, Stephen Biegun, headed for talks in Pyongyang in preparation for the summit. Biegun said last week that while no lifting of sanctions without denuclearization was the policy before, Washington is now ready to take the first steps to support North Korea's badly needed economic development before sanctions are lifted. That's an admission that the U.S. is backing down from its previous position of not removing any sanctions. So I fear that Trump's pledge to solve the North Korea problem one way or the other is going to be a failure, because diplomacy is clearly failing to bring it to denuclearization, and the military option is clearly not on the table, never will be on the table. And that means that North Korea will still become the trigger event for North Korea, for World War III, because the longer that Trump allows them to continue to build nuclear weapons in secret, I don't care if they're not testing any missiles or nuclear weapons at this time, they're still building them. Remember, they've successfully tested powerful nuclear weapons and missiles. All they have to do now is put them into serial production in secret facilities. I have talked a lot about the Russian and Chinese threat in the World Affairs Brief, especially about the new hypersonic missiles, the large 15 warhead Sarmat missiles, and how those are going into serial production. The Russia in particular is ahead of China in terms of technology. We don't really have a good idea of what China is fully developing because they do so in secret, but we can bet that China is trying to do hypersonic. They're also building a blue water navy, which they need to defend their empire after they take control, they believe, after World War III, of their version of the New World Order. I have long talked about the fact that North Korea's trigger event will start World War III. It's the perfect trigger event. If they do ever attack the South under some provocation, the U.S. would probably have to use tactical nuclear weapons to stop that attack. And that could be used as China and Russia as an excuse for attacking the United States, saying you started the war with first use of nuclear weapons. I have not believed until this time that the Russian and Chinese would be ready until about the middle of this next decade to start a war. It doesn't mean, and I've never said it will start in the middle of the next decade, only that they will be ready to do so. But recently, China has decided that they're going to build 4 new aircraft carriers after the successful launching of their first aircraft carriers. And they said that they'll be ready for deployment in 2035. So this is the first weapon systems that Russia and China, or China in particular, has said will put their development into not the coming decade, but the follow-on decade of the 30s. Now, this doesn't mean, for example, that they'll wait that long until those carriers are developed. Let me explain, because this is essential to your understanding of the timing of World War III, which I've always believed is the major threat that we need to be preparing for. Don't believe there's going to be economic collapse or social unrest or martial law before then, but that waiting for a war, the powers that be have the power to cover all of their actions and justify them with a world war. Here's the controversy. Why does China develop nuclear aircraft carriers and a nuclear task force mimicking the West if in fact they know and plan to use nuclear weapons to destroy our aircraft carrier task force? It's particularly disturbing that most of our aircraft carrier retrofit happens in 3 locations: Norfolk, Virginia, San Diego, California, and in the Bremerton, Washington, Seattle area. So we have 3 basic retrofit and repair bases of which can make them easily targeted. It's very disturbing that in December, all of our nuclear carriers were back in port, making them easy targets. I'm sure that wouldn't have happened unless the U.S. was, convinced there was no threat of attack at this time. But it sets a bad precedent. The U.S. is now engaging under President Trump, and I don't know how long this will last if Trump doesn't get reelected in 2020, but they're now engaging in a new anti-ballistic missile system and a new continental ballistic missile system. This is very heartening because the military under President Trump has finally realized that a anti-ballistic missile system with a kinetic kill vehicle, which is a depleted lump of uranium, is not a good way to take out ballistic missiles, incoming ballistic missiles, because the kinetic kill vehicle or the lump of uranium has to make physical contact with the warhead to destroy it. All of Russia's ABM systems have explosive warheads, so that even in a near miss, they can destroy or take that warhead off target so that it doesn't land at the target that it's aiming for. So the question is, these weapon systems are not going to be ready for the United States ostensibly till 2030 area. And I had always said previously that developing a new intercontinental ballistic missile to replace the Minuteman III, which was designed in the 1950s, and which its triple warhead has been replaced with a single warhead for disarmament purposes, that wouldn't do much good if the war starts in the middle of the next decade. So here's the question: will China wait until the U.S. develops these new weapon systems? And the U.S. is also working on a hypersonic weapon system to catch up with the Russians and the Chinese. Will China and Russia wait until the 2030s when their aircraft carriers are done? Or will they attack before the U.S. new missiles are deployed and before their new effective ABM systems are deployed? The kill rate of U.S. ABMs was about 50% under ideal test conditions with a kinetic kill vehicle. They're hopefully going for a much, much higher percentage of kill and a much larger number of actual weapons, not counting the Aegis anti-ballistic missile system that is shipborne. Our land-based missile systems, in Alaska, which is basically looking at the polar shot from Russia coming over, or Vandenberg Air Force Base, number less than 30 in terms of ABM units able to take on ballistic missiles. That's nothing compared to the minimum 3,500 atomic warheads that Russia alone, without China, is capable of sending our way. So that's the question. Will China wait and Russia wait to preemptively strike the United States in 2030s versus the middle of the next decade because of their emerging weapon systems? Or might they strike earlier before the U.S. is ready to counter those with bigger and larger ICBMs and anti-ballistic missile systems? That's an important decision to make, but we will never know when they're going to be ready for this nuclear strike. And so it's important to be ready as soon as everyone can be ready. And that means, and let me cover some of the things in which you need to prepare for that. Of utmost importance besides your food and water, which a lot of you at that preparedness conference are already prepared to do, and the equipment, you must have some type of radiation shelter. Now, there's very few targets within the Utah-Idaho area that need to concern us, but there is, for those of you from Utah, Hill Air Force Base, a major target, Dugway Proving Ground. And there's also the areas in Las Vegas, Area 51, of that fallout will drift into the southern Utah area. But Idaho's biggest threat, there is a Mountain Home Air Force Base that's a nuclear target there near Boise. But the majority of fallout will probably come from the Seattle area if the wind is blowing from the northwest. And you'll get fallout in that area from the San Diego or other population centers, which have military targets in San Francisco and Los Angeles as well. So everyone really needs to prepare for fallout. And that's why we've written that special book called The High Security Shelter, my son and I, so that you can, it's the cheapest way to get a fallout shelter in the room is to build it within an existing basement. It's a very good do-it-yourself manual, and you can find these things at Joel's website, joelskousen.com. Most of you live in, if you live in the Idaho area, you don't have to relocate unless you're directly downwind of the nuclear site in Idaho, and but everyone's going to need to protect themselves against fallout, because fallout is going to be very real anyway. And it's very, very important to also have a radiation meter, because you have to be able to tell when to come into the shelter and when to come out of the shelter, and if you have to go back into the shelter because of another wave of fallout coming. So that's extremely important. My other book, for those of you who have more ambitious plans to build a more extensive shelter, is called The Secure Home. And that tells how to do everything in preparedness, from solar to generators to underground construction to remodeling and building an addition to your home to provide a fallout shelter, plus all of the equipment. Both the High Security Shelter book and the Secure Home have a huge appendix in them with all the hard-to-find listings of equipment, including NBC filters and radiation meters, so that we've saved you a lot of time in finding that equipment. I hope that you will take our encouragement to prepare. We all hope that things will not happen as it looks like they're going to happen, but we really shouldn't bet against it. In fact, I can say with 100% certainty that someday we will have nuclear war with Russia and China. So it's something that has to be prepared for in advance. And I hope that my remarks today will help you to realize that this is going to happen. I worry too that too many people expect that Trump to save us, to drain this deep swamp. As I explained in the World Affairs Brief, he cannot do so if he can't recognize or tell who's deep state and who isn't. Remember that he replaced James Comey, who was deep state, with Christopher Wray, who was deep state. Brett Kavanaugh, who he named to the Supreme Court as a supposed conservative, was deep state. He was the cover-up artist for the Ken Starr investigation over the Vince Foster murder. And the new Attorney General nominee, William Barr, was also the fix-it man for George H.W. Bush, a globalist. Barr covered up for Iran-gate. He covered up for the Iran-Contra scandal and many other things that were going on in terms of drug importation through the deep state during the George H.W. Bush administration. So it's important to realize that Trump is not going to save us. If you're believers in QAnon, claiming that there's going to be thousands of arrests of deep state people, there's a lot of disinformation about that. All of the November deadlines that QAnon set were going to happen have come and gone. Of course, he's got excuses of why this didn't happen, but I can tell you that it's not going to happen. This is the secret combinations that were prophesied, that if we allow to take over our government, that all is lost. And I feel assured that they have taken over the government. We've gotten a very good glimpse on how they operate, trying to take down Trump almost daily through their control of the media and the courts. So I'm saying be pessimistic about winning this battle. In other words, prepare for the takedown. That doesn't mean we stop fighting for liberty. It doesn't mean we stop trying to encourage people to learn about conspiracy and to be aware so they aren't fooled into what's going to happen when this war comes and our leaders tell us that they didn't know about it, and they tell us that we need to round up dissenters who believe in conspiracy. I realize there's a great deal of risk, but we need to be prepared always to fight for what's right and to know what's going on in the world. I have mentioned my World Affairs Brief. I would encourage all of you to become subscribers. You can get a free sample issue of the World Affairs Brief simply by emailing me at editor@worldaffairsbrief.com. And it's been a pleasure to speak with you, and I will now entertain some questions from you.